On a peaceful evening in the heart of Hiroshima, the city seemed to settle into its familiar rhythm. Apartment windows glowed one by one against the darkening sky. The quiet hum of televisions drifted through narrow hallways, and the distant echo of an elevator door sliding open blended seamlessly with the usual soundtrack of a city known for its safety. Hiroshima had long been regarded as one of the most orderly and tranquil urban centers in Japan, a place where violent crime rarely disturbed the routine of daily life. Yet beyond the 14th floor of one residential tower, that illusion of absolute safety had already been shattered long before anyone realized it. Inside an apartment that looked no different from any of its neighbors, a horrifying truth lay silently on the floor. A young Vietnamese woman, who had come to Japan with an ordinary dream of earning a living and building a future for her child, was motionless in a pool of blood. The curtains hung still. The air was stagnant, heavy with the metallic smell that signaled irreversible tragedy. There were no screams when police arrived, no signs of forced entry, only the unsettling quiet of a crime that demanded answers. Months earlier, this same woman had survived a mysterious assault near her home. The attacker had been described only as a woman with an average frame and an unfamiliar presence that vanished as quickly as it appeared. At the time, the incident was treated as an isolated act of violence. But now, as officers examined the silent apartment, questions began to form. Was this truly a separate event, or part of a calculated plan that finally reached its fatal conclusion on the 14th floor? Who would wait, watch, and strike again with such precision? Before long, investigators discovered a detail that changed the tone of the entire scene. A trail of bloody footprints wound from the victim's body toward the front door. Some prints were sharp, others blurred, as if the perpetrator had stepped in the spreading pool of blood and then fled in panic. The prints pointed outward, not inward. They told the story of someone who had left quickly, someone who still had the warmth of the victim's blood on their shoes when they reached the hallway. These horrifying stories are more than cold headlines on the front page. They are sharp slices of the darkest corners of human behavior, where lines between desperation, anger, and intent become difficult to trace. That is why cases like this remain unforgettable. To stay with us as we open the next file and examine the next criminal portrait, select subscribe and the notification bell icon now. In the world of crime, the truth never grows old. What happened inside this silent apartment, and why did fear seem to follow the victim long before her final moments? To answer that, we must return to the beginning, before the blood on the floor, before the shattered camera, and before the door opened for the last time. The investigation began in the narrow hallway outside the apartment, where the final echoes of the husband's panicked footsteps still seemed to linger. According to his account, he had returned home after a long shift at the mechanical workshop, stepped out of the elevator on the 14th floor, and walked toward his door with the familiar relief of a man who believed his day was ending normally. Yet the moment he turned the key and pushed the door open, his world collapsed into a single horrifying image. Inside the apartment lay his wife, motionless, surrounded by blood that had already begun to settle and darken on the cold tile floor. He had attempted to shake her, tried to call her name, but the chill of her skin and the depth of her wound left no room for hope. In a state of complete shock, he ran from the apartment, shouting for help, and then made his way directly to the Hiroshima Nishi police station. When officers arrived, they did not find chaos in the hallway or signs of disturbance outside the unit. Everything appeared deceptively calm, as if the violence had been contained entirely behind the closed door. This contrast between the silent corridor and the bloody room beyond it set the tone for the investigation. The officers entered the apartment slowly, careful not to disturb any trace. What they encountered confirmed the gravity of the husband's report. The victim lay face up on the living room floor. Her long dark hair was soaked and matted into the blood beneath her head. Her eyes were slightly open, frozen in a vacant gaze that suggested she had not had the chance to fully comprehend the attack. The smell of blood was overpowering, heavy and metallic, lingering in the stagnant air surrounding her body. Deep red stains splattered across chair legs, the lower part of the wall, and the floor tiles. A large, irregular pool had formed directly beneath the wound on her head. Medical personnel who examined her on site confirmed that she had died hours earlier, likely not long after the attack itself. The condition of the room told investigators that the victim had fought fiercely. Several glasses lay shattered on the floor. A chair had been knocked sideways. Drawers throughout the living room and bedroom were pulled open, their contents strewn across the floor. Clothing, papers, and blankets lay in disordered piles, creating the impression of a frantic struggle that had moved from one end of the room to the other. The sofa cushions were displaced, and a blanket from the couch had fallen to the ground, partly stained by the spreading blood. Near the victim's hands, officers noticed broken fingernails with fresh scratches beneath them. These small traces held considerable significance. Forensic experts believe the victim had likely clawed at the perpetrator during the assault, attempting to push, pull, or hold on to something in a desperate effort to escape. The possibility that fragments of the perpetrator's skin or hair might remain under her nails introduced an early hope for DNA evidence. A more chilling discovery came next, beginning just inches from where the victim lay and continuing across the living room toward the front door, was a chain of footprints stamped in blood. Some were cleaner impressions, while others were smeared or distorted, as if the weight of each hurried step had shifted unevenly. The orientation of the prints indicated movement from inside the room outward, suggesting that the perpetrator had stepped directly into the pool of blood before fleeing. The short stride length, the uneven rhythm, and the shallow depth of the impressions would later help forensic examiners approximate the perpetrator's size, gender, and body weight. But even at this early stage, one conclusion was clear. The killer had left in haste, not composure. The officers followed the footprints to the entryway. Near the threshold, one of the victim's slippers lay askew, its surface speckled with blood. The other slipper was found several feet away, near the far corner of the room, as if it had been kicked or flung aside during the struggle. This detail suggested that the victim had been either approaching the door or preparing to leave the apartment when she was attacked. A shattered mobile phone rested under a small table beside the sofa. Its screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, and the metal frame was bent inward. Investigators believed the victim may have attempted to call for help, only to lose her phone in the violent confrontation. When officers examined the area outside the apartment door, they discovered something that shifted the investigation from a standard homicide to a deliberate, premeditated act. The security camera mounted directly above the door had been smashed. The lens was shattered, and the power cable had been torn from the wall. The destruction showed intention, strength, and planning. Someone had made sure that no digital record of their visit remained. This raised an immediate question. How had a stranger known the exact location of the camera? And how had that person managed to enter a secure apartment building without attracting attention? Investigators surveyed the building's layout and quickly realized that the entrance area did not require keycard access. Residents could move freely between floors, and non-residents could enter the lobby without being challenged. This architectural oversight, common in older residential buildings, created an opportunity for someone to reach the upper floors without encountering security barriers. The perpetrator could have walked calmly into the building, taken the elevator, and waited outside the victim's door for the perfect moment. While forensic teams continued their careful documentation, officers began searching for the murder weapon. They checked the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen drawers, and even the balcony. They looked behind appliances, under furniture, and inside cabinets, but there was nothing. The absence of the weapon suggested either that the killer had brought it with them or had used an item from the apartment and then taken it away. The nature of the victim's head wound indicated a heavy object with a hard, defined edge. Whatever that object was, it had vanished with the killer. As officers stepped back to re-examine the room as a whole, an unsettling portrait of the incident began to form. The victim had been attacked suddenly, without warning. She had resisted with everything she had, but the ferocity of the blows overwhelmed her. The scene was explosive yet targeted, chaotic yet deliberate. The bloody footprints and the destroyed camera added to the sense that the perpetrator had acted with determination, but had lost composure as the crime unfolded. Now, investigators were left with a single, urgent task. Every footprint, every smear, every broken item had to be traced, analyzed, and interpreted before the perpetrator could disappear into the quiet streets of Hiroshima. The clock had already been ticking for hours. As investigators expanded their work beyond the blood-stained apartment, they understood that every homicide begins long before the fatal moment. The physical traces inside the room could describe the violence, but the motives, fears, and vulnerabilities that surrounded the victim required a different kind of examination to reconstruct the final hours of her life. Detectives began by retracing the quiet routines that had defined her existence in Hiroshima. The victim was a woman in her early 30s, a Vietnamese national who had come to Japan seeking stability and opportunity. She lived in the 14th floor apartment with her husband, who worked long shifts at a mechanical workshop. Their child, an 8-year-old, remained in Vietnam with grandparents. Like many migrant families, the couple had accepted temporary separation in order to build financial security. According to neighbors, the pair carried themselves with politeness and modesty. They kept a low profile, greeted others respectfully, and never caused disturbances. To the Vietnamese community in Hiroshima, the victim was known as gentle, sociable, and helpful. There were no reports of conflict, tension, or behavior that might have drawn unwanted attention. Yet when detectives looked deeper, they discovered that the victim's life had not been entirely peaceful. Months before her death, an incident occurred that cast a long shadow over everything that followed. At the end of May 2025, the victim had been assaulted by a woman near her residence. The attacker struck quickly and without warning. In her panicked state, the victim had difficulty recognizing identifying features, but she remembered the attacker as a woman of Asian appearance with an average build. Fortunately, a passerby intervened, causing the attacker to flee. The victim was taken to the hospital with injuries to her hand and shoulder, injuries that were described as minor but deeply frightening. Hiroshima police recorded the case as intentional assault, opened an investigation, but ultimately found no clear suspect or motive. With no further developments, the file faded quietly into the background. However, the psychological damage did not fade. According to close acquaintances, the victim became noticeably uneasy after the attack. She often spoke of the sensation of being watched. She avoided walking alone and grew anxious when approaching her apartment late in the day. Although she attempted to return to her habits, the fear lingered, shaping her movements and her conversations. She confided to friends that she no longer felt entirely safe, even inside her own building. When news of the murder spread among the Vietnamese community, a woman named Dung, who claimed to be a close acquaintance, publicly shared a series of private messages with the victim. These messages revealed a second, more intimate source of distress that the victim had been experiencing. According to these conversations, the victim had discovered that her husband was involved in an extramarital relationship with another Vietnamese woman living in Hiroshima. The alleged other woman was said to be a fellow migrant whose work visa was nearing expiration. Based on the victim's own words, this woman had become increasingly insistent, allegedly attempting to maintain her residency in Japan by relying on her relationship with the victim's husband. The situation did not remain indirect or subtle. The victim described confrontations in which the other woman pressured her to give up her marriage voluntarily. These exchanges left the victim deeply shaken. She expressed emotions ranging from sadness to confusion and disbelief. She told friends that she had never imagined her marriage would be challenged so openly. The verbal pressure soon became psychological pressure. Each day, she felt her sense of security eroding, pulled apart by fear from one side and betrayal from the other. In several messages, the victim wrote that she felt danger approaching. Her intuition, shaped by the assault in May, told her that something worse might occur. Friends advised her to report the matter to authorities or move to a different apartment. However, she and her husband were nearing the end of their work contracts, and both hoped to return to Vietnam soon. Because of this, they hesitated. They believed they only needed to endure a little longer before leaving Japan behind. Now, as detectives reviewed these messages, the earlier assault, and the violent death inside the apartment, they saw a picture that was far more complex than a simple robbery or random intrusion. The victim had been under emotional strain. She had been afraid. She had sensed the approach of harm long before her final day. The investigators understood that the motive for the murder might not lie within the apartment, but within the relationships that surrounded it. With these revelations in hand, Hiroshima Prefectural Police escalated their response. Only 2 days after the homicide, a special investigative unit of approximately 70 officers was established. The creation of such a large task force indicated the seriousness with which local authorities regarded the case. At the head of this team stood Wakabayashi, the chief of the Criminal Investigation Division, a veteran investigator known for his methodical approach and his insistence on evidence-driven conclusions. The first objective of the task force was to tightly reconstruct the timeline of the victim's final day. They reviewed neighbor testimonies, medical reports, digital traces, and building records. Several neighbors recalled hearing a brief scream early in the morning on October 15th. None of them saw anything, and the noise was too short to provoke immediate action. Around midday, another neighbor reported hearing a heavy thud from the ceiling. At the time, he believed someone had dropped furniture or knocked over a household item, but after the murder was discovered, this detail became significant. Forensic examination later determined that the victim had died around midday, consistent with the neighbor's account of a loud impact. This meant the attack had likely occurred hours before her husband returned home. The timing was precise and strategic. Whoever had committed the murder seemed to know when the victim would be alone. Investigators then turned their focus to security footage from outside the building. Although the hallway lacked cameras, the main entrance, elevator area, and nearby streets were monitored by cameras maintained by the building management and surrounding businesses. Detectives extracted and reviewed hours of footage from the morning until early evening. It was through this exhaustive search that they made a breakthrough. In footage captured shortly before the estimated time of death, a woman entered the building wearing a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low, and a mask covering her face. Her posture was tense, her movements quick, She kept her head down, avoiding the camera. Approximately 1 hour later, the same figure exited the building carrying a small handbag she did not have when she arrived. The timestamp aligned almost perfectly with the narrowed window of the crime. The discovery shifted the momentum of the investigation. At that moment, the victim's troubled personal life, the earlier assault, and the violent crime scene converged into a single question. Who was this woman on the footage, and how did she fit into the victim's world? The discovery of the masked woman on surveillance footage gave investigators their first tangible lead. Until that point, the case had moved through layers of uncertainty, emotional distress, a past assault, and a tumultuous private life that offered more speculation than direction. But this woman, entering the building shortly before the estimated time of death and leaving shortly after, represented the first clue grounded in observable evidence. The time had come for the investigation to shift from reconstruction to pursuit. The task force began by analyzing the woman's movements frame by frame. Her posture suggested caution. Her downward gaze showed awareness of the cameras. Her stride was short and deliberate, mirroring the characteristics inferred from the bloody footprints inside the apartment. Although her mask concealed most of her face, her long black hair, neatly tied at the back, her body proportions, and her average height were clearly visible. Investigators noted that she carried no bag or visible weapon upon entering, but exited with a small handbag in hand. This detail raised immediate suspicion. If the bag had belonged to the victim, it could indicate theft or an attempt to remove evidence from the scene. The next step required cross-referencing these features with the local Vietnamese community. Hiroshima Prefectural Police maintained a residential database of foreign workers and technical trainees, a common administrative system in Japan that allowed authorities to verify legal residency status. Investigators compared the physical description, the estimated age, and the recorded movements with individuals known to live in or near the city. It was during this phase that a name emerged: Ding Thi Huang, 32 years old, a Vietnamese technical intern trainee who resided in Seki Ward, not far from the scene of the crime. She had lived in Japan for several years, maintained a clean record, and worked a stable job. Her passport photo, when compared to the partial images from the footage, showed a striking resemblance in facial shape, hairstyle, and physical proportion. Moreover, investigators discovered connections between her social media activity and several individuals within the victim's circle. Her account, known under the alias Huang Cherry, displayed interactions that aligned suspiciously with names and conversations found in the victim's personal messages. These overlapping details elevated Huang from a coincidental match to the primary suspect. But identifying her was only the first step. Japanese criminal procedure required irrefutable physical evidence before an arrest warrant could be issued. Investigators had to move carefully, balancing urgency with precision. For several days, the task force placed Huang under discreet surveillance. Officers observed her living habits, monitored her routine, and examined whether she attempted to flee or destroy potential evidence. She did not appear to deviate from her normal lifestyle, a detail that could indicate composure or could reflect her belief that the destruction of the apartment camera had erased any trace of her presence at the crime scene. Meanwhile, detectives prepared an emergency request for a search warrant, citing the serious nature of the homicide, the strength of the circumstantial evidence, and the need to prevent the loss of crucial physical traces. The warrant was approved. On the morning of October 25th, exactly 10 days after the murder, a special operations unit executed the search at Huang's residence. Investigators entered the apartment swiftly and methodically, securing the scene before beginning their detailed inspection. What they found would prove decisive. Inside a small wardrobe, officers discovered a pair of sneakers with a distinct sole pattern. When these shoes were compared to the bloody footprints from the crime scene, the match was unmistakable. The shape, size, pressure points, and tread design aligned perfectly. More damning were the dark brown stains visible along the sole and upper fabric. These stains were immediately collected for forensic testing. In addition to the shoes, officers found a dark jacket and a baseball cap resembling the clothing worn by the woman in the security footage. These items were sealed and transported to the forensic laboratory for urgent examination. Hours later, the results arrived. The stains on the sneakers tested positive for human blood. Further analysis confirmed that the blood type matched the victim's. This evidence created a direct, unbroken chain linking Huang to the crime scene. Footprints matched her shoes. Footage matched her appearance. Blood matched the victim. The circumstantial evidence had transformed into physical proof. With the evidence secured, investigators moved forward with the arrest. Huang was apprehended without resistance. Media reports described her wearing gray clothing, escorted by officers, her wrists bound by handcuffs. As she faced the camera flashes of assembled reporters, she remained silent, Police officials later stated that she neither admitted nor denied involvement during questioning. Instead, she chose to withhold statements pending further legal counsel. Under Japanese law, the charges outlined at the time of arrest included illegal trespass, theft, and homicide. Authorities also initiated a parallel investigation to determine whether she had been involved in the earlier assault on the victim in May. If confirmed, this would suggest a prolonged pattern of hostility and planning rather than a single impulsive act. The revelation of the suspect's identity reverberated through the local Vietnamese community. It was a profoundly unsettling development. The perpetrator was not a stranger or an anonymous figure, but a compatriot with a shared history of migration and hardship. Community members expressed shock and sadness, struggling to comprehend how a conflict surrounding relationships, jealousy, or personal disputes could escalate into an act of lethal violence. Many expressed sympathy not only for the victim, but also for the broader implications the case carried for the Vietnamese diaspora in Japan. At this stage, investigators prepared to present a reconstructed timeline of the events. Based on accumulated evidence, they believed Huang had closely monitored the victim's daily schedule. She waited for the moment when the victim's husband would leave for work. Once the apartment was empty, Huang entered the building, ascended to the 14th floor, and waited outside the victim's door. The moment the door opened, she launched the attack. The weapon had not been recovered, but the nature of the injuries suggested repeated blows with a heavy object. After the victim collapsed, Huang searched the apartment, possibly in an attempt to stage the crime as a robbery or to locate specific items connected to their personal conflict. Before leaving, she destroyed the hallway camera, then fled the building, unaware that other surveillance systems had already captured her arrival and departure. By the time police connected the traces, 10 days had passed. But the evidence had endured long enough to lead investigators to her doorstep. Yet even as the prosecution prepared their case, another force worked its way into the narrative. Public speculation. Rumors spread quickly online, suggesting that the suspect was romantically involved with the victim's husband, and that the murder was part of a deeper conspiracy. These allegations remained unconfirmed by official sources. Still, they added a new layer of complexity to a case already defined by fear, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Now, with the arrest complete but the investigation ongoing, one question lingered above all others. Had Huang acted entirely alone, driven by personal motives, or was there a deeper arrangement hidden behind the tragedy? After the arrest of Dinty Huang, investigators believed that the structure of the case had become more coherent. The physical evidence pointed in one direction: the surveillance footage, the bloody footprints, the shoes discovered in her residence, and the biological traces all aligned with the hypothesis that she had entered the apartment, attacked the victim, and fled. Under ordinary circumstances, such a convergence of evidence would lead the public to conclude that the case was effectively solved. Yet as the days passed, the narrative surrounding the homicide became increasingly entangled in speculation. Information flowed rapidly through online communities in Vietnam, where the emotional connection to the victim generated widespread concern. Posts, comments, and fragmented claims began to circulate, often expanding upon or reshaping the facts presented by Japanese authorities. Among these claims, one allegation grew louder than the rest: the possibility that the victim's husband, Levanton, had been involved in a deeper conspiracy with Huang. The theory suggested that their alleged relationship had motivated the killing, transforming the event from an act of individual violence into the product of collusion. Such claims did not originate from official channels. Nevertheless, they spread quickly. In Japan, investigators noted the rumors but refrained from offering public commentary. Police officials stated only that the husband had provided full cooperation, and that no evidence at that time directly implicated him in orchestrating the crime. However, the existence of earlier messages in which the victim expressed distress about her husband's alleged affair gave the rumors a foundation that, in the public eye, felt difficult to dismiss. This presented a challenge for investigators, who were required to balance transparency with the protection of ongoing investigative integrity. In cases of interpersonal violence, especially those involving romantic conflict or emotional strain, the presence of multiple possible motivations often complicates the analysis. Investigators therefore revisited the timeline of the day of the murder, the husband's movements, and the physical evidence from the apartment in an attempt to clarify whether any supporting traces existed. According to workplace records and security footage, the husband was confirmed to be at his place of employment during the probable time of the attack. His alibi was consistent, and there were no discrepancies in his movements that day. Furthermore, forensic experts noted that the crime scene contained no indications of a second individual. The struggle patterns, the direction of the movement, and the distribution of blood suggested a single assailant. The destroyed camera in the hallway aligned with the theory of a single perpetrator attempting to erase visible entries and exits. These elements reinforce the idea that the primary suspect had acted alone. Yet investigators also acknowledge that speculation often arises where motive remains unclear. This dual pressure from public scrutiny and investigative standards compelled the task force to broaden the scope of their inquiry. They initiated a concurrent examination into the assault that had occurred in May. Detectives compared patterns between the two incidents, searching for consistencies in timing, physical proximity, and operational behavior. The victim's description of her attacker in May, although vague, did not conflict with Huang's general appearance. Furthermore, the geographical proximity of both incidents strengthened the hypothesis that the same individual may have been responsible. While forensic evidence from the earlier assault was insufficient to confirm involvement, investigators sought witness statements, hospital records, and any overlooked physical traces from the previous event. Their intention was not only to determine whether Huang had attacked the victim twice, but also to establish whether the motive had existed long before the murder itself. Simultaneously, investigators examined Huang's digital footprint. They reviewed her social media activities, communication history, and daily routines in the weeks leading up to the homicide. They looked for indicators of personal conflict, emotional instability, or financial strain. They also searched for connections between her and the victim's husband, although communication logs revealed overlapping acquaintances within the community. No official statement confirmed the existence of a romantic relationship. The absence of verified evidence meant that investigators could not attach legal weight to the widespread claims circulating online. Another critical component of the investigation revolved around motive. Japanese authorities approached this aspect methodically. They considered three broad possibilities: financial motivation, personal conflict, and emotional grievance. The alleged theft of cash and small valuables inside the apartment supported a financial motive, but the intensity of the violence, as reflected in the number and severity of the wounds, suggested deeper emotional involvement. The victim's earlier messages expressing fear of another woman, as well as her psychological state after the assault in May, suggested that personal conflict could explain the heightened aggression. Investigators also analyzed whether jealousy, resentment, or perceived social displacement might have contributed to the escalation. Despite these broad considerations, Japanese police emphasized that no motive would be declared until the suspect's official testimony or corroborated evidence established it. Yet this restraint only intensified public speculation, particularly in Vietnam, where audiences followed the case closely through social media, community groups, and independent commentary. Some individuals questioned the reliability of the husband's alibi. Others speculated about long-term disputes or hidden relationships. And still others argued that the case reflected broader challenges faced by migrant workers abroad. These diverse interpretations contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty. This environment placed significant pressure not only on the investigators, but also on the Vietnamese community in Hiroshima. Many community members expressed fear that the case would reinforce negative stereotypes or result in unfair scrutiny of Vietnamese residents. Community leaders encouraged cooperation with authorities and urged restraint when discussing the case publicly, emphasizing the importance of relying on verified information rather than unconfirmed assumptions. Meanwhile, forensic laboratories continued to analyze the physical evidence collected from Huang's residence. Specialists examined the fabric of her clothing, searching for microscopic particles, hair strands, or fibers that might further support the timeline of events. They conducted DNA tests on the scraps found under the victim's fingernails, comparing them against the suspect's profile. They also analyzed the bag Huang carried when leaving the building, checking for fingerprints, blood traces, or missing personal items belonging to the victim. Each step was intended to provide a comprehensive picture of the crime, one grounded in verifiable evidence rather than conjecture. As investigators prepared to finalize the preliminary case summary, they reached a critical point. The evidence strongly indicated that Huang had entered the building alone, attacked the victim, searched the apartment, and fled. However, the broader circumstances surrounding her actions remained unclear. Had she intended to confront the victim directly about a personal matter? Had she been motivated by jealousy or resentment? Or had she attempted a forced conversation that escalated unpredictably into lethal violence? Without a confession, the answers remained uncertain. Japanese authorities stated only that the investigation was ongoing and that further details would be released when legally appropriate. For now, the tragedy remained suspended between the facts illuminated by forensic science and the unanswered questions that lingered in the shadows of public speculation. The complexities of human relationships, the consequences of concealed tensions, and the fragility of trust formed the backdrop of a case that had shaken two nations and revealed the hidden vulnerabilities within a seemingly ordinary life. In the aftermath of the investigation, the apartment on the 14th floor returned to its quiet state. The crime scene tape was eventually removed. The hallway resumed its usual stillness, and the city continued its steady rhythm. But for those who had followed the case, and for the community that had been shaken by the violence, the silence carried a different weight. It was the silence left behind when an ordinary life is interrupted by an act of devastating brutality. The victim, a young mother who had crossed borders to build a better future, could no longer speak for herself. The responsibility of telling her story rested with investigators, with friends, and with every trace preserved in the case file. Although the suspect had been arrested and the physical evidence appeared strong, many questions remained unanswered. The suspect had not offered a confession, nor had she provided an explanation for the violence that occurred inside the apartment. Without a complete account, the motives behind the crime remained clouded, leaving space for public speculation. But in the realm of law, speculation is never enough. Japanese authorities emphasized that the truth would be determined not by rumor, but by verifiable evidence, forensic findings, and legal testimony. The judicial process would move forward based on documented facts, guided by the principles that protect both victims and the accused. The tragedy revealed the fragile conditions under which many migrant workers live abroad, far from home, navigating financial pressures and complicated personal relationships. Individuals can sometimes find themselves in situations where unspoken tensions accumulate silently. Yet the vast majority maintain their integrity, support one another, and work tirelessly to sustain their families across thousands of miles. This case was a painful reminder that when conflict escalates unchecked, the consequences can be irreversible. For the victim's family, the loss extended beyond grief. A husband faced the trauma of discovering his wife's lifeless body. A child, separated by distance, would grow up with his absence of a mother whose plans for the future ended abruptly and violently. Friends within the Vietnamese community struggled to reconcile their memories of her gentleness with the brutality of her final moments. In this sense, the tragedy was not confined to one apartment. Its impact radiated outward, touching the lives of everyone connected to her. As the legal proceedings moved forward, officials stated that further information would be released once the court reached formal conclusions. Until then, caution prevailed. The investigation continued to scrutinize every detail, ensuring that the case would be judged fairly and thoroughly under Japanese law. Whatever sentence might eventually be issued, it would reflect the severity of the crime, the depth of the loss, and the significance of justice for a life taken without warning. Cases like this remind us why forensic work, investigative diligence, and judicial transparency matter. They answer the questions that the victim can no longer voice. They restore clarity where violence has created chaos. And they affirm that, even in darkness, the search for truth remains essential. What do you believe constitutes an appropriate sentence in a case defined by such planning, violence, and lasting harm? Share your thoughts below. Thank you for watching, and until the next story, stay safe and stay aware.